The coffee cup trembled in Marcus Thornfield's hands as the young waitress leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper against the thunderous silence of his racing heart. "Your daughter's in danger," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the kitchen, where the familiar clatter of dishes continued its oblivious rhythm. The words hit him like ice water, freezing the breath in his lungs and turning his world inside out in the span of 3 seconds. He had been sitting in the same corner booth at Rosie's diner for exactly 43 minutes, staring at his untouched breakfast while his phone buzzed incessantly with calls from his assistant, his lawyers, his board members, all the vultures circling the carcass of his latest acquisition deal. The eggs had grown cold, their yellow centers congealed like tiny suns dying on the white porcelain plate. The bacon lay crisp and forgotten, its edges curled like autumn leaves. But Marcus Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Industries and worth approximately $3.2 billion, couldn't bring himself to care about food when his 17-year-old daughter Emma hadn't answered his calls in 3 days. The waitress, Sarah, her name tag read, though the S was partially obscured by a small coffee stain, had been watching him for the better part of an hour. She was maybe 22, with strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and tired green eyes that seemed to hold secrets far beyond her years. Her uniform was the standard pink and white checkered dress that Rosie's had been using since the 1960s, complete with a small apron tied at her waist. But there was something in her posture, the way she moved between tables with calculated precision, that suggested she was more than just another college student working for tips. Marcus had noticed her earlier when she'd refilled his coffee for the 3rd time without being asked, her movements fluid and purposeful. She had lingered just a moment longer than necessary, her eyes scanning the dining room with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to watching, waiting, calculating. It was a look he recognized. He'd seen it in corporate boardrooms and hostile negotiations, in the eyes of people who knew things, who held cards close to their chest until the moment was right to play them. "What did you say?" Marcus whispered back. His hands, usually steady from years of high-stakes negotiations, were visibly shaking now as he set the coffee cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. The diner around them continued its normal morning rhythm. Truckers hunched over plates of hash browns and eggs, elderly couples sharing newspapers in comfortable silence, teenagers giggling over shared milkshakes. But for Marcus Thornfield, the entire world had narrowed to this moment, this booth, this girl who claimed to know something about Emma. Sarah glanced around again, her movements quick and nervous like a sparrow checking for predators. "She can't talk here," she said, her voice so low he had to lean forward to catch every word. "Meet me behind the diner in 10 minutes, the loading dock area. Come alone." She straightened up, her professional smile snapping back into place like a mask, and in a louder voice said, "Can I get you anything else, sir? More coffee?" Marcus shook his head, unable to trust his voice. His mind was racing, cycling through every possible scenario. Emma had been distant lately, more so than the typical teenage rebellion he'd come to expect. She'd been spending more time away from their estate in the hills, claiming to be studying at friends' houses or working on school projects that required late nights in the library. He had attributed it to her senior year stress, the pressure of college applications, and the normal social dynamics of 17-year-olds. But now looking back with the sharp clarity that fear brings, he could see the signs he'd missed. The way she'd grown quiet when he entered a room, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when he was nearby, the dark circles under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights filled with worry rather than teenage excitement. The diner's atmosphere felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made the familiar sounds seem amplified and strange. The sizzle of bacon on the grill became sharp and aggressive. The murmur of conversation turned into an indecipherable wall of noise, and the clink of silverware against plates created a percussion of anxiety that matched his rapid heartbeat. Marcus found himself studying every face in the room, wondering who else might know something about Emma, who else might be watching him with those calculating eyes. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with his daughter, 3 weeks ago when she'd asked him about his work, about the companies he acquired and what happened to the people who worked there. It had been an unusual question for Emma, who typically showed little interest in his business dealings beyond the lifestyle they afforded her. But that night, she'd pressed him with unexpected intensity, asking about due diligence processes, about background checks on business partners, about whether he ever worried about the people he trusted with sensitive information. At the time, he'd been touched by what he'd assumed was her growing maturity, her budding interest in eventually joining the family business. He'd answered her questions thoughtfully, explaining how corporate acquisitions worked, how trust was earned and verified in the business world, how even the most powerful people were vulnerable when they let the wrong person get too close. He'd shared stories from his early career, the mistakes he'd made by trusting too quickly, the hard lessons that had taught him to verify everything and assume nothing. But now, sitting in this diner with Sarah's words echoing in his mind, those questions took on a sinister new meaning. Had Emma been trying to warn him about something? Had she stumbled onto information that put her in danger? Or worse, was she somehow involved in something that threatened not just her safety, but his entire empire? Marcus pulled out his phone and tried Emma's number again, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. Her voice, bright and cheerful in the recorded message, felt like a mockery of his current panic. "Hi, you've reached Emma. I'm probably doing something way more fun than talking on the phone, so leave a message and maybe I'll call you back if you're lucky." The beep that followed sounded like a death knell. He left his 4th message in as many hours, trying to keep his voice calm and paternal. "Emma, it's Dad again. I need you to call me back immediately. It's important. Please, sweetheart, just call me. I love you." He hung up and stared at the phone's black screen, seeing his own reflection distorted in the glass. A man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single decision, reduced to helpless desperation by the silence of his only child. The 10 minutes Sarah had requested felt like hours. Marcus forced himself to take slow, measured breaths, to think logically about the situation. He was Marcus Thornfield. He didn't panic. He didn't make rash decisions. He didn't let fear cloud his judgment. But Emma was his one weakness, the single crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor. She was all he had left of Catherine, his wife, who died in a car accident when Emma was only 8 years old. Everything he'd built, every deal he'd closed, every dollar he'd earned had been for her, to give her a life free from want or worry, to ensure her safety and happiness, to honor Catherine's memory by raising her daughter to be strong and independent. As he sat there, Marcus found himself remembering the day Emma was born, how she'd looked up at him with those enormous blue eyes that were exactly like her mother's, how her tiny fingers had wrapped around his index finger with surprising strength. Catherine had laughed at his tears, calling him a soft-hearted businessman who was going to spoil their daughter rotten. She'd been right, of course. Marcus had never been able to deny Emma anything, had given her every advantage money could buy, the best schools, the finest tutors, travel to exotic locations, exposure to art and culture and experiences that most people could only dream of. But somewhere along the way, in his effort to give Emma everything, he had perhaps forgotten to simply be present. The long hours at the office, the constant travel for business, the endless phone calls and meetings and negotiations, it had all been for her, he'd told himself. But now he wondered if she'd seen it differently. Had she felt abandoned by his success? Had she sought attention and validation elsewhere, perhaps from people who didn't have her best interests at heart? The thought made his stomach clench with guilt and fear. He pulled out his wallet and left a $20 bill on the table, far more than the meal was worth, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused entirely on the coming conversation with Sarah, on what she might know about Emma, on what dangers her daughter might be facing while he sat helpless in a diner booth, powerless perhaps for the first time in his adult life. As he stood to leave, Marcus caught sight of himself in the diner's mirror, a tall man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair that was usually perfectly styled, but now showed the effects of his anxious fingers running through it repeatedly. His blue eyes, so similar to Emma's, were rimmed with red from lack of sleep and worry. His expensive suit, tailored to perfection by London's finest clothiers, somehow looked rumpled and out of place in the humble surroundings of Rosie's diner. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate father whose world was crumbling, whose wealth and power meant nothing in the face of his daughter's danger. Marcus made his way through the diner's back exit, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor with each measured step. The kitchen staff barely glanced up from their prep work, too absorbed in the morning rush to pay attention to another customer leaving through the rear door. But Marcus noticed everything. The way the cook's eyes tracked his movement, the slight pause in the dishwasher's rhythm, the manner in which Sarah had positioned herself near the coffee station with a clear view of his path. These weren't coincidences. In his world, there were no coincidences. The loading dock behind Rosie's diner was a study in urban decay and forgotten dreams. Concrete steps, cracked and weathered by decades of harsh winters, led down to a small platform where delivery trucks had once unloaded supplies in more prosperous times. Now it served mainly as a smoking area for employees and a gathering place for the kind of people who preferred the shadows to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Empty cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly against the brick wall, their edges softened by rain and time. The smell of grease from the kitchen's exhaust fan mixed with the acrid scent of cigarettes and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or desperation. Sarah was already waiting when he arrived, having somehow slipped out through what must have been a kitchen exit while he'd made his more circuitous route. She had changed out of her waitress uniform into jeans and a dark hoodie, the transformation so complete that Marcus might not have recognized her if not for those distinctive green eyes. She was smoking a cigarette, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been inside the diner, and Marcus realized that her earlier nervousness had been an act, or at least partially so. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, taking a long drag from her cigarette before flicking it away into the shadows. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "My daughter is missing," Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled, but edged with the kind of authority that came from years of commanding rooms full of hostile executives. "I would walk through fire if it meant finding her. Now tell me what you know." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. He was accustomed to being the one doing the evaluating, but one holding all the cards and controlling the flow of information. But here, in this forgotten corner behind the small-town diner, the power dynamic was reversed, and he found himself at the mercy of someone who looked young enough to be his daughter's classmate. "Emma isn't missing," Sarah said, finally, her words hitting him like a physical blow. "She's hiding. There's a difference." Marcus felt his knees weaken slightly, and he reached out to steady himself against the brick wall. Relief and terror warred in his chest. Relief that Emma was alive, terror at what she might be hiding from. Hiding from what? From whom? "From the people you trusted," Sarah said, pulling a second cigarette from her pocket, but not lighting it, just rolling it between her fingers like a nervous habit. "The people who were supposed to protect you. The people who've been using your love for your daughter as a weapon against you for months." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, visible and choking. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world begin to shift and crack. The foundations of trust and security he'd built his life upon suddenly revealed as fragile as glass. "I don't understand. Who are you? How do you know Emma?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and hollow, the sound of someone who had learned too young that the world was a dangerous place for those without power or protection. "I'm someone who's been where Emma is now. Someone who knows what it's like to be 17 and scared and completely out of your depth because the adults in your life failed you." She lit the cigarette with shaking hands, the brief flare of the lighter illuminating the shadows under her eyes, the set of her jaw that spoke of resilience born from survival. Emma came to me 3 weeks ago, Sarah continued, her voice soft but clear in the morning air. She'd been working with a private investigator, someone she hired with her own money, her allowance and birthday money, because she was afraid to ask you for help. She'd discovered some things about your business partners, about people close to you who weren't what they seemed. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as memory supplied the context Sarah's words were missing. 3 weeks ago was when Emma asked him those strange questions about due diligence and trust. She hadn't been showing interest in his business. She'd been trying to warn him, trying to protect him from something she'd discovered but didn't know how to share. What did she find? He asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Sarah took another drag from her cigarette, buying time, or perhaps gathering courage. Your head of security, James Morrison, the man you've trusted with your daughter's safety, with access to your home, your schedule, your most private information. He's been selling that information to your competitors, to people who want to destroy you. But worse than that, he's been using Emma to get it. The world tilted on its axis. James Morrison had been with Marcus for 8 years, ever since Catherine's death, when Marcus had realized that wealth made his family a target. James had impeccable credentials, former Secret Service, with commendations and references that had checked out perfectly. He'd been the one to design the security systems for their home, the one who had driven Emma to school events and social functions, the one who had sat with Marcus in the hospital waiting room when Emma had her appendix out 2 years ago. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he was remembering things, small inconsistencies he'd dismissed, moments when James had asked questions that seemed slightly outside his purview, times when Emma had seemed uncomfortable around the man who's supposed to protect her. Emma figured it out when she noticed that every major business move you made was somehow anticipated by your competitors. She started paying attention to who had access to information before deals went public. She tracked patterns, kept notes, and eventually narrowed it down to 3 people who could have been the source. James was one of them. Marcus found himself thinking about his recent acquisitions, deals that should have been locked down, but had somehow fallen through at the last minute when competitors had inexplicably made better offers. He'd attributed it to bad luck or clever corporate espionage, but now he was seeing it in an entirely different light. How did she confirm it was James? She set a trap. She fed each of the 3 suspects different false information about a fictional acquisition you were planning. Only the information she gave James made it to your competitors. When she saw her fake company name appear in a Wall Street Journal article about potential merger targets, she knew she'd found her leak. Pride and terror warred in Marcus's chest. Emma had shown the kind of strategic thinking and investigative skills that would have impressed him in any business context. But the fact that she'd felt compelled to investigate threats to their family alone, without his help or protection, filled him with guilt and self-recrimination. What kind of father was he that his daughter couldn't come to him when she was in danger? But that's when things got complicated, Sarah said, stubbing out her cigarette against the brick wall. Because James realized what Emma was doing. She got sloppy, or maybe she just got scared. He caught her going through his things, his files, his computer. And instead of confronting you directly, he decided to use the situation to his advantage. How? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. He told Emma that he had evidence that would destroy you, falsified documents that would make it look like you were involved in insider trading, tax evasion, things that would not only ruin your business, but send you to prison. He said that he had already planted the evidence where investigators would find it, and that the only way to protect you was for Emma to help him get access to information about your upcoming deals. Marcus felt sick to his stomach as he imagined his 17-year-old daughter carrying that burden, believing that her father's freedom depended on her cooperation with the man who was betraying their family. She was trying to protect me.
She was being manipulated by a master manipulator, Sarah corrected gently. James Morrison isn't just selling your information for money. He's been working for Victor Reeves. The name hit Marcus like a punch to the solar plexus. Victor Reeves was his oldest rival, a man whose business empire had grown in direct opposition to Marcus's own success. They'd been competing for the same deals for over a decade, with Victor seemingly always one step ahead, always knowing just what offer to make to steal a contract from under Marcus's nose. Marcus had respected Victor's business acumen, even as he despised the man's ruthless tactics. But this, using his daughter as an unwitting asset, this was beyond corporate rivalry. This was personal warfare. Emma realized she was in over her head when James started asking her for more than just information, Sarah continued, her voice growing harder. He wanted her to plant listening devices in your home office, to copy files from your personal computer, to essentially spy on her own father. That's when she reached out to me. "How do you know my daughter?" Marcus asked again, because this was the piece of the puzzle that still didn't fit. Sarah seemed too young, too working class, too removed from Emma's privileged world to have formed any natural connection. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that Marcus couldn't see. When she spoke again, her voice was soft with old pain. "My sister Lucy was Victor Reeves's daughter. She died 2 years ago." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with implication and sorrow. Marcus found himself remembering news reports from 2 years ago about Victor Reeves's daughter, a promising young woman who had died in what was ruled an accidental overdose. At the time, Marcus had felt sympathy for his rival, knowing that no amount of business success could compensate for the loss of a child. Now he was seeing that tragedy in an entirely different light. "Lucy tried to expose what her father was doing," Sarah continued, her hands now visibly trembling as she lit another cigarette. She'd discovered that he wasn't just competing fairly in business, he was destroying lives, manipulating people, using their children as weapons against them. She tried to stop him, tried to gather evidence to expose him, and she died for it. "You don't think it was an accident?" Marcus said, though it wasn't really a question. "Lucy had been clean for 6 months when she died," Sarah replied, her voice flat with suppressed rage. "She was in therapy, she was going to meetings, she had plans for the future. She didn't relapse. She was murdered, and everyone knows it, but no one can prove it because Victor Reeves has enough money to buy silence and enough connections to bury evidence." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just corporate espionage or business rivalry. This was a man who was willing to destroy families, to manipulate children, possibly even to commit murder in pursuit of his goals. And Emma was caught in the middle of it, believing that she was protecting her father when she was actually being used as a weapon against him. "Emma found me through Lucy's old social media accounts," Sarah explained. "Lucy had written about me in some of her posts, about how I was the only person who believed her when she said her father was dangerous. Emma reached out because she needed someone who would understand what she was going through, someone who had experience dealing with Victor Reeves and his tactics." "Where is she now?" Marcus asked, his voice urgent with paternal desperation. "Somewhere safe." But her eyes didn't meet his. "Somewhere James Morrison can't find her, somewhere Victor Reeves can't reach her. But Marcus, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Marcus because we're past formalities now, she won't stay hidden forever. She's 17, she's scared, and she thinks the only way to save you is to disappear permanently from your life."
The thought of Emma living in hiding, believing that she had to sacrifice her relationship with her father to protect him, was more than Marcus could bear. He had built his empire to give her security and freedom, not entrap her in a web of danger and deception. "I have to find her. I have to make this right." "You can't just charge in like some kind of corporate superhero," Sarah warned, her voice sharp with urgency. "James Morrison is still reporting your every move to Victor Reeves. He's probably already told them about this meeting, about your strange behavior this morning. If you do anything that seems out of character, anything that suggests you're onto them, they'll know that Emma has talked, and they'll do whatever it takes to silence her permanently." Marcus felt trapped between his desperate need to protect his daughter and the realization that any direct action might put her in even greater danger. It was a position he'd never found himself in before. Powerless despite his wealth, helpless despite his connections, unable to simply buy or negotiate his way out of a problem. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing an opponent who was willing to play by rules so savage that Marcus's traditional advantages were not just useless, but potentially harmful. "What do I do?" he asked, and the words tasted like defeat in his mouth.
Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, a recognition of his genuine desperation perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the love for his daughter that was evident in his every word and gesture. "We have to be smarter than they are," she said finally. "We have to make them think they're still in control while we gather the evidence we need to destroy them completely. And we have to do it in a way that keeps Emma safe." The first thing Marcus had to do was return to his normal routine, act as though nothing had changed, as though his daughter's life wasn't hanging in the balance with every decision he made. The drive back to his estate took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads lined with oak trees whose autumn leaves created a canopy of gold and crimson above the pristine asphalt. Normally, this drive soothed him, the gradual ascent from the bustling valley below to his private sanctuary in the hills, the way the world fell away behind him until he felt like he was ascending to some kind of modern Olympus where the concerns of ordinary mortals couldn't reach him. But today, every turn of the road felt like a potential ambush, every shadow between the trees a possible hiding spot for enemies he was only now learning to recognize. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his BMW so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and he found himself checking the rearview mirror compulsively, looking for signs of surveillance that his newfound paranoia insisted must be there. The Thornfield estate sprawled across 200 acres of prime hillside real estate, its main house a masterpiece of contemporary architecture that had been featured in Architectural Digest and copied by wealthy executives across the country. Glass and steel curved together in impossible harmony, creating walls that seemed to float above the landscape while framing views of the valley below that took visitors' breath away. As the wrought iron gates recognized his car and opened silently to admit him, Marcus found himself seeing his home through different eyes. Every security camera became a potential vulnerability, every glass wall a target, every technological convenience a possible entry point for people who wished him harm. The house that had been his sanctuary was now revealed as what it had always been, a beautiful cage perched on a hill, isolated and exposed. James Morrison's car was parked in the circular driveway exactly where it always was on Tuesday mornings. The man himself emerged from the front door as Marcus pulled up, his appearance as perfectly professional as always, tall and lean, with the kind of military bearing that spoke of discipline and competence, dressed in a dark suit that managed to look both formal and functional. His salt and pepper hair was cut short, his face clean-shaven, his eyes alert and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly air that belied his security background. "Good morning, Marcus," James said, his voice carrying the slight Boston accent that Marcus had always found reassuring. It spoke of old money and establishment values, of people who understood discretion and loyalty. Now, that accent sounded sinister, every familiar inflection a mockery of the trust Marcus had placed in this man. "You're running a bit behind schedule. The conference call with the Tokyo investors is in 20 minutes. Marcus forced his expression to remain neutral, drawing on decades of experience in hiding his emotions during difficult negotiations. "I had to make a stop," which was technically true if misleading. "Is Emma up yet?" James's expression didn't change, but Marcus thought he detected something, a slight tightening around the eyes perhaps, or a fractional pause before the response came. "I haven't seen her this morning. Her car wasn't in the garage when I arrived, so I assume she's already left for school." It was a lie, smoothly delivered and completely plausible. Emma's car was a red convertible BMW that she'd received for her 17th birthday, and she did often leave early for school activities or to meet friends for breakfast. But Marcus now knew she hadn't been to school in 3 days, that she was somewhere in hiding while James Morrison pretended to monitor her safety and whereabouts. "I'll try calling her later," Marcus said, playing his part in the charade while his mind raced with implications. How long had James been lying to him about Emma's whereabouts? How many times had Marcus asked after his daughter's safety while the man responsible for protecting her was actively placing her in danger? The conference call with Tokyo was torture,
Marcus sat in his home office, surrounded by monitors and technology that now felt like potential weapons turned against him, listening to Japanese executives discuss market penetration strategies and profit margins while his mind was completely focused on Emma. Where was she sleeping? Was she safe? Did she have enough money for food? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, making it impossible to concentrate on the business discussions that would normally command his complete attention. James stationed himself outside the office door during the call, as he always did, ostensibly to ensure Marcus wasn't disturbed. But now Marcus understood that James was really there to monitor his conversations, to gather intelligence about upcoming deals and corporate strategies that he could pass along to Victor Reeves. The man who was supposed to be his shield was actually his greatest vulnerability, the enemy inside the walls who had been systematically dismantling his empire from within. After the call ended, Marcus made a show of reviewing quarterly reports, while his mind worked furiously on the real problem he faced. Sarah had given him her cell phone number and instructions to text only if absolutely necessary. Phone calls could be monitored, she'd warned, and James Morrison had access to technology that could intercept conversations even from secure landlines. The paranoia felt surreal, like something from a spy movie rather than his carefully ordered life. But Marcus was beginning to understand that the rules he'd lived by no longer applied. Around noon, his assistant Patricia buzzed him on the intercom. Patricia had been with him for 12 years, a supremely competent woman in her 50s who managed his schedule, his communications, and much of his day-to-day business operations with the efficiency of a Swiss timepiece. She was one of the few people Marcus trusted completely, though now he found himself wondering if that trust was misplaced as well. "Marcus, there's a Detective Rodriguez here to see you. She says it's about Emma." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The presence of police could mean only two things: either Emma was found or something terrible had happened to her. He looked up to see James Morrison in the doorway, the man's face arranged in an expression of professional concern that Marcus now recognized as masterfully crafted deception. "Shall I have her wait in the conference room?" James asked, his voice carrying just the right note of protective efficiency. "Send her in here," Marcus replied, not wanting James to have any opportunity to speak with the detective privately or to position himself as an intermediary in whatever news she brought. Detective Rodriguez was a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing as they swept the office. She wore a simple gray suit that managed to look both professional and slightly rumpled, as though she'd been working long hours on difficult cases. There was something in her posture that reminded Marcus of Sarah, the same alert watchfulness, the same sense of someone who had seen enough of the world's darkness to be perpetually cautious. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm Detective Maria Rodriguez with the County Sheriff's Office," she said, offering her hand for a firm handshake. "I'd like to ask you some questions about your daughter Emma." Marcus's mouth went dry, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Is she all right? Has something happened to her?" "We're not sure, sir. Emma was reported as a missing person by her school when she failed to show up for classes yesterday and today without any notification. Since she's 17, we're required to investigate when a minor goes missing, especially in cases involving wealthy families where kidnapping might be a concern." Marcus felt a complex mix of relief and terror. Emma wasn't hurt, at least not that the police knew of, but her disappearance was now official, public, part of the record. That meant Victor Reeves and James Morrison would know that authorities were involved, which could either provide protection for Emma or escalate the dangers she faced. "I've been trying to reach her," Marcus said carefully. "She hasn't been answering her phone. I assumed she was staying with friends, maybe dealing with some typical teenage drama." Detective Rodriguez pulled out a small notebook and pen, her movements precise and economical. "When did you last speak with Emma?" Marcus had to think carefully about his answer. The truth was that his last real conversation with Emma had been 3 weeks ago, but admitting that would make him sound like a neglectful father and might expose the real reason for Emma's absence. We had dinner together on Sunday, which was technically true, though they'd barely spoken during the meal, and Emma had seemed distracted and worried. Did she mention any problems she was having? Issues at school, conflicts with friends, anything that might cause her to want to disappear for a few days? Before Marcus could answer, James Morrison stepped forward, his expression grave and concerned. "Detective Rodriguez, I'm James Morrison, head of security for the Thornfield family. I've been monitoring Emma's activities as part of her protection detail, and I can tell you that she's been under some stress lately about college applications and her social life. Teenage girls can be quite dramatic about these things." Marcus watched Detective Rodriguez's face carefully as James spoke, looking for any sign that she recognized the manipulation in his words. James was doing exactly what Sarah had warned about, positioning himself as the authority on Emma's behavior while subtly undermining the seriousness of her disappearance. But the detective's expression remained professionally neutral, giving nothing away. "I'd like to see Emma's room, if that's possible. Sometimes we can learn about a person's state of mind from their personal belongings, notes they might have left, that sort of thing." Marcus nodded and started to stand, but James was already moving toward the door. "I'll show you the way, Detective. I'm familiar with the layout of the house and any security considerations." "Actually," Detective Rodriguez said, her voice mild but firm, "I'd prefer to have the family member present. Mr. Thornfield, would you mind accompanying me?" It was a small victory, but Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward the detective for maintaining proper protocol and not allowing James to control the investigation. They made their way through the house's expansive corridors, past the formal living areas in the chef's kitchen, up the curved staircase to the second floor, where Emma's suite of rooms occupied the entire east wing. Emma's room was a shrine to adolescent transition, part little girl's fantasy with stuffed animals and photos from childhood vacations, part young woman's sophistication with designer clothes and makeup that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her bed was made with the kind of precision that spoke of either excellent housekeeping staff or a teenager trying to maintain control in a chaotic world. But as Detective Rodriguez began her examination, Marcus started to see signs that he'd missed during his cursory visits to his daughter's space. The detective noticed them too. "These drawers have been gone through recently," she observed, pointing to Emma's dresser where the contents were neatly arranged, but somehow looked disturbed. "And there's a gap on this bookshelf where something was removed." Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized what the missing item was. Emma's laptop, the expensive MacBook he'd given her for her birthday, was gone from its usual place on her desk. Either she had taken it with her when she went into hiding, or someone else had removed it to eliminate evidence of her investigation into James Morrison and Victor Reeves. "Her laptop is missing," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Detective Rodriguez made a note. "Teenage girls often take their computers with them when they're planning to be away from home. It could be a good sign. Suggests this was planned rather than the result of foul play." But Marcus caught something in the detective's tone that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own reassuring words. She continued her examination of the room with methodical thoroughness, checking the closet, the bathroom, even looking under the bed and behind furniture. It was during this search that she found something that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Mr. Thornfield," Detective Rodriguez said, her voice carefully neutral, "I'm going to need you to step back, please." She was crouched next to Emma's nightstand, using a pen to lift what appeared to be a small electronic device from behind the piece of furniture. It was black, about the size of a quarter, with a tiny antenna that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through Emma's windows. "What is that?" Marcus asked, though he was already beginning to understand. "It's a listening device," the detective replied, dropping the bug into an evidence bag. "Professional grade, expensive. Someone has been monitoring your daughter's private conversations." The room seemed to spin around Marcus as the full implications hit him. Emma hadn't just discovered that James Morrison was betraying their family. She'd been living under surveillance, her most private moments monitored and recorded by the very man who was supposed to protect her. No wonder she'd felt unsafe in her own home. No wonder she'd reached out to a stranger like Sarah instead of coming to her father with her fears. James Morrison appeared in the doorway at that moment, drawn perhaps by some sixth sense that told him his carefully constructed web of deception was beginning to unravel. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his eyes immediately focusing on the evidence bag in Detective Rodriguez's hand. "Mr. Morrison," the detective said, her voice taking on a new edge of authority, "I'm going to need to speak with you about your security procedures. Specifically, I need to know who has had access to this room and when these surveillance devices might have been installed." Response smooth and immediate. "Of course, Detective. I'd be happy to help with your investigation. However, I should point out that those devices aren't part of our security system. Someone unauthorized has been conducting surveillance on the Thornfield family, which is exactly the kind of threat I've been hired to prevent." It was masterfully done. James had managed to position himself as an ally in the investigation while simultaneously distancing himself from the evidence of his own surveillance. Marcus felt a grudging admiration for the man's skill, even as he despised him for using that skill to manipulate and betray his family. "I'll need a complete list of everyone who has had access to this room in the past month," Detective Rodriguez said, making notes in her pad. "Security staff, housekeeping, maintenance workers, anyone who might have had an opportunity to plant surveillance equipment." "I'll have that for you within the hour," James replied. "I keep detailed logs of all personnel movements within the house. Security is my top priority." After Detective Rodriguez finished her examination of Emma's room and left with promises to begin a formal missing person investigation, Marcus found himself alone with James Morrison for the first time since learning of the man's betrayal. They stood in his office, the same room where James had been gathering intelligence for months, and Marcus had to use every ounce of his self-control to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed. "I don't like this, Marcus," James said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern. "The surveillance devices suggest that Emma may have been targeted by someone with significant resources and sophisticated equipment. We need to consider the possibility that she's been kidnapped." The irony was suffocating. James Morrison, the man who had been systematically betraying the Thornfield family for months, was now expressing concern for Emma's safety while simultaneously positioning himself to control the investigation into her disappearance. Marcus wondered how many other families had been destroyed by this man's expert manipulation, how many children had been used as weapons against their parents' success. "What do you recommend?" Marcus asked, playing his role in the charade, while his mind worked furiously on plans of his own. "I'd like to bring in additional personnel, upgrade our surveillance systems, and implement new protocols for monitoring all communications coming in and out of this house. If someone has taken Emma, they'll likely make contact with ransom demands or other instructions." Marcus nodded as though he found this reasonable, but every suggestion James made would actually serve to increase the man's control over information and access to the Thornfield family's private affairs. Additional security personnel meant more potential allies for James. Upgraded surveillance meant more opportunities to monitor Marcus's activities, and controlling communications meant James could intercept any attempts Emma might make to contact her father directly. "Do whatever you think is necessary," Marcus said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Emma's safety is the only thing that matters." "I'll make the calls immediately," James replied, already reaching for his phone. "And Marcus, I know this is difficult, but you need to try to maintain your normal routine as much as possible. If this is a kidnapping, the perpetrators will be watching for signs that you're cooperating with law enforcement or taking any actions that might threaten their plans. It was almost funny in a dark way how James's advice was actually sound. Marcus did need to maintain his normal routine and avoid actions that might alert his enemies to their knowledge of their plans. But the enemy wasn't some unknown kidnapper. It was the man standing in his office, offering protection while planning his destruction. That evening, Marcus attended a charity gala that had been on his calendar for months, a gathering of the city's elite to raise money for children's education. Under normal circumstances, he would have enjoyed the event. It combined his genuine desire to support worthy causes with valuable networking opportunities and the kind of social obligations that came with his position in the community. But tonight, every conversation felt like a performance, every smile a mask hiding his desperate worry for Emma. Victor Reeves was there, of course. The man moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, accepting congratulations on his latest acquisition and making small talk with politicians and business leaders who sought his favor. He was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of distinguished appearance that suggested wisdom and integrity. Wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes. When Victor approached Marcus near the silent auction tables, offering condolences about Emma's disappearance that had apparently already become common knowledge among their social circle, Marcus had to grip his champagne flute tightly to keep from throwing it in the man's face. "I heard about your daughter," Victor said, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned sympathy. "How terrifying for you. I remember when my Lucy went through her rebellious phase. Teenagers can be so unpredictable. I'm sure Emma will turn up soon, probably embarrassed about the worry she's caused." The casual mention of Lucy, Victor's daughter, who had died under suspicious circumstances, was clearly intended as a threat. Marcus understood the subtext. Victor was reminding him of what happened to children who tried to expose their parents' enemies, warning him that Emma could meet the same fate if Marcus didn't play by the rules of this deadly game. "Emma is a sensible girl," Marcus replied, managing to keep his voice steady. "I'm sure she'll make smart choices about her safety." "Of course," Victor agreed, his smile widening slightly. "Smart girls learn quickly about the consequences of making poor decisions. I do hope she's learned to be more careful about the company she keeps and the information she shares." It was another warning, more explicit this time. Victor was telling Marcus that he knew Emma had been investigating him, that he was aware of her attempts to expose his manipulation of James Morrison. The threat was clear: stay quiet, or Emma would suffer the same fate as Lucy Reeves. Marcus excused himself from the conversation as soon as politeness allowed, but the damage was done. He now understood that Emma wasn't just hiding from James Morrison, she was fleeing from Victor Reeves, a man who had apparently killed his own daughter to protect his secrets and wouldn't hesitate to harm Emma if she posed a threat to his plans. The drive home from the charity gala was a nightmare of winding mountain roads and racing thoughts. Marcus found himself checking his rearview mirror constantly, convinced that he was being followed, that Victor's people were monitoring his every movement. The headlights of cars behind him became threats, the shadows between trees became hiding places for enemies, and his beautiful home in the hills became a fortress under siege. James Morrison was waiting when Marcus arrived, full of updates about the increased security measures he'd implemented. Additional guards had been stationed around the property, new cameras had been installed in previously unmonitored areas, and a sophisticated communications intercept system had been activated to monitor all phone and internet traffic coming or to from the estate. "If anyone tries to contact you about Emma, we'll know about it immediately. And if she tries to reach out herself, we'll be able to trace the call and determine her location. Marcus nodded and made appropriate responses, but his mind was focused on the trapped feeling that was growing stronger by the hour. Every security improvement James implemented was actually another layer of surveillance and control, another way to isolate
Marcus from any outside help or communication with Emma. He was becoming a prisoner in his own home, surrounded by enemies disguised as protectors. Late that night, as Marcus lay sleepless in his bed, he heard the soft sound of his phone buzzing with a text message. He checked the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. "Your daughter wants to see you. Tomorrow at noon. The old lighthouse on Miller's Point. Come alone or she disappears forever." Marcus stared at the message, his heart racing as he tried to determine if it was genuine or a trap. The lighthouse on Miller's Point was a location that held special meaning for his family. He and Catherine had taken Emma there many times when she was younger, making it a favorite spot for family picnics and quiet conversations about life and dreams in the future. It was possible that Emma had chosen this location because she knew her father would recognize its significance, but it was equally possible that James Morrison or Victor Reeves had learned about the family connection and were using it to lure Marcus into a vulnerable position. But as Marcus lay there in the darkness, weighing the risks and possibilities, he realized that it didn't matter whether the message was genuine or a trap. Emma was his daughter, his only child, the most important thing in his world. If there was any chance that she was reaching out to him, any possibility that he could help her or bring her home safely, he had to take it. The alternative, sitting safely in his fortress while Emma remained in danger, was unthinkable. He deleted the message and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring either reunion with his daughter or a confrontation with the enemies who were determined to destroy his family. Either way, the waiting would finally be over. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus barely slept that night, his mind cycling through endless scenarios of what might await him at Miller's Point. The old lighthouse had been abandoned for over 30 years, its beam long since replaced by modern GPS navigation systems that made the rocky coastline safe for ships without the need for human lighthouse keepers. But the structure itself remained, a weathered stone tower standing sentinel over the churning Pacific waters, surrounded by windswept cliffs and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forests. He and Catherine had discovered the lighthouse during their first year of marriage, when they were still young enough to find romance in exploring forgotten places and making memories in locations touched by history and solitude. They had brought Emma there regularly throughout her childhood, packing elaborate picnics and spending entire afternoons watching the waves crash against the rocks below while she played among the wildflowers that grew in stubborn patches between the ancient stones. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that this place of happy family memories might now be the setting for a confrontation that could determine whether his family had any future at all. As he lay in his bed listening to the whisper of wind through the pine trees that surrounded his estate, he found himself remembering Emma as a 7-year-old, fearlessly climbing the lighthouse's iron ladder to peer out through the windows of the lamp room while he and Catherine called nervous warnings from below. Even then, she had been curious and brave, determined to see the world from every possible angle. At dawn, Marcus rose and went through the motions of his normal morning routine, knowing that James Morrison would be monitoring his behavior for any signs that something had changed. He showered and dressed in his usual business attire, read through his emails and market reports, and had breakfast in the dining room while reviewing the day's schedule with Patricia over the phone. To any observer, he appeared to be a wealthy businessman dealing with the stress of his daughter's disappearance by throwing himself into work and maintaining familiar patterns of behavior. But beneath the surface, Marcus was preparing for what might be the most important meeting of his life. He had spent hours during the sleepless night thinking through every possible scenario, every potential threat, every way the confrontation at Miller's Point might unfold. He had considered bringing backup, calling Detective Rodriguez, even hiring his own security team to counter James Morrison's surveillance. But ultimately, he kept coming back to the words in the text message, "Come alone or she disappears forever." Whoever had sent that message, whether it was Emma herself or someone using her as bait, had made the stakes perfectly clear. Any deviation from their instructions, any sign that Marcus was not acting in good faith, could result in losing Emma permanently. It was a risk he simply couldn't take.
At 11 o'clock, Marcus announced to Patricia that he was going for a drive to clear his head, a departure from routine that was unusual but not unprecedented. James Morrison immediately offered to accompany him or to have one of the security team follow at a distance, but Marcus declined, saying he needed some time alone to think about the investigation and what steps to take next. "I understand," James said, his expression perfectly calibrated to suggest empathy and professional concern. "But please keep your phone on and check in every hour. In situations like this, we can't be too careful about your safety." Marcus agreed to the check-ins, knowing they would give him a maximum of 1 hour at Miller's Point before James would expect contact. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. He left the estate in his BMW, driving slowly down the mountain roads while checking his mirrors for any signs of surveillance. James had undoubtedly placed tracking devices on all of his vehicles, but Marcus was counting on the man's arrogance and his need to maintain the pretense of protecting, rather than monitoring, his employer. The drive to Miller's Point took 45 minutes through increasingly remote countryside, past small farms and dense forests, where cell phone coverage became spotty and the modern world seemed to fade into memory. Marcus had made this journey hundreds of times with his family, but today every familiar landmark felt charged with new significance. The weathered barn where Emma had insisted on stopping to pet horses, the roadside stand where they had bought fresh strawberries every summer, the scenic overlook where Catherine had taken what would be their last family portrait, all of these places now felt like potential witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. The dirt road leading to the lighthouse was overgrown with blackberry vines and potholes that threatened to bottom out his expensive sedan, but Marcus pressed forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel as branches scraped against the car's paint and stones pinged against the undercarriage. When he finally emerged into the clearing around the lighthouse, his heart was pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The lighthouse stood exactly as he remembered it, its white-painted stone walls weathered but solid, its red roof tiles faded by decades of salt air and storms. The wooden stairs that led up to the entrance were sagging and partially rotted, and the windows of the lamproom were clouded with age and neglect. But the structure itself radiated the same timeless strength that had made it a sanctuary for his family during happier times. Emma was sitting on a piece of driftwood near the cliff's edge, her long blonde hair whipping in the ocean breeze, her posture tense with the alertness of someone who had learned to watch for danger. She was wearing jeans and a dark hoodie that made her look older than her 17 years, and Marcus could see even from a distance that she had lost weight, that there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "Emma," he called out as he climbed from his car, his voice carrying across the open space despite the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. When she turned at the sound of his voice, Marcus saw tears spring to her eyes as she stood and ran toward him. For a moment, all of the fear and tension and complexity of their situation fell away, and there was only a father and daughter reuniting after a separation that had felt like an eternity. Marcus caught her in his arms and held her tightly, feeling the tremor in her shoulders as she began to cry against his chest. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice muffled by his jacket. "I wanted to tell you everything, but I didn't know how, and then it got so complicated, and I was afraid that if I came home, James would know that I'd figured out what he was doing, and then you'd be in even more danger." "Shh," Marcus murmured, stroking her hair with hands that shook slightly with relief and residual fear. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to figure this out together. But first, I need to know, are you hurt? Are you safe? Where have you been staying?" Emma pulled back to look at him, and Marcus could see the weight of adult concerns in her young face, the burden of knowledge that no 17-year-old should have to carry. "Sarah's been helping me," she said. "She has this friend who runs a women's shelter, and they've been letting me stay there.
But Dad, it can't last forever. These women need those beds for people who have nowhere else to go. And besides, James Morrison knows I'm alive. He's been looking for me. Marcus felt his blood run cold at the thought of James actively hunting for Emma while pretending to help search for her. How do you know he's looking for you? Because he's been asking questions at my school, showing my picture around town, talking to my friends? Emma replied, her voice growing stronger as she shifted into the role of someone sharing crucial intelligence. He's telling everyone that I'm having some kind of emotional breakdown, that I might be suicidal or dangerous to myself. He's positioning it so that if something happens to me, people will think it was self-inflicted. The cold calculation behind James Morrison's strategy was breathtaking in its cruelty. By spreading rumors about Emma's mental state, he was not only creating a cover story for any harm that might come to her, but also undermining her credibility if she tried to expose his activities. Who would believe the accusations of a mentally unstable teenager against a respected security professional with impeccable credentials? Emma, I need you to tell me everything, Marcus said, taking her hands in his and looking directly into his eyes. Everything you discovered about James, about Victor Reeves, about how long this has been going on. I know some of it from Sarah, but I need to hear it from you. Emma nodded and began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush of revelations that painted a picture of betrayal more extensive than Marcus had imagined. She told him about the patterns she'd noticed in his failed business deals, about the investigation she'd conducted using her own money and resources, about the trap she'd set that had confirmed James Morrison as the source of leaked information. But then she revealed something that made Marcus's world tilt on its axis. Dad, it's not just about business information. James has been drugging you. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, leaving him struggling to process their implications. What do you mean, drugging me? Your coffee, Emma said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind and waves. Every morning, James brings you that special blend he orders from that boutique shop in the city. He's been adding something to it, something that makes you more trusting, less suspicious, more likely to accept his suggestions without questioning them. Marcus felt his legs go weak, and he sat down heavily on the piece of driftwood Emma had been occupying when he arrived. The morning coffee ritual was James's idea, implemented shortly after Catherine's death when Marcus had been struggling with grief and insomnia. James had presented it as a small luxury, a way to start each day with something beautiful and comforting in the midst of loss and chaos. The coffee was indeed exceptional, rich and complex, with a flavor that seemed to improve Marcus's mood and help him focus on the day ahead. Now he understood that the improved mood and enhanced focus were not the result of excellent coffee beans, but of pharmaceutical manipulation designed to make him more compliant and less likely to question James's expanding role in his life and business affairs. How many crucial decisions had he made while under the influence of whatever substance James had been feeding him? How many opportunities to discover the betrayal had he missed because his judgment was chemically compromised? How did you figure it out? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with shock and self-recrimination. I noticed that you were different after you had your morning coffee, Emma explained. More relaxed, more trusting, less likely to challenge people or ask difficult questions. And then I started paying attention to James's behavior, the way he always insisted on preparing your coffee himself, the way he got nervous if you wanted to skip it or have something else instead. So I took a sample of the coffee grounds from his private supply and had them tested at a lab. What did they find?
Benzodiazepines, Emma said, the medical term sounding strange in her young voice. Low-dose, slow-release formulations that would make you calmer and less suspicious without making you obviously impaired. It's the kind of thing that would be almost impossible to detect unless you were specifically looking for it. Marcus felt sick as he realized the full scope of the violation he'd endured. James Morrison hadn't just betrayed his trust and endangered his family, he had been systematically poisoning him, altering his brain chemistry to make him easier to manipulate and control. It was a level of betrayal so intimate and invasive that it felt almost like rape, a violation of his most basic autonomy and dignity. "Why didn't you come to me as soon as you discovered this?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because I was afraid you wouldn't believe me," Emma admitted, tears starting to flow again. "James has been so careful to position himself as indispensable, so skilled at making you dependent on him for everything related to security and protection. And because of the drugs, you were more trusting of him than you would normally be. I was terrified that if I accused him without absolute proof, he would convince you that I was lying or delusional, and then he'd have an excuse to remove me from the house entirely." Marcus understood now why Emma had felt so isolated and desperate that she'd reached out to a stranger like Sarah instead of coming to her own father for help. James Morrison had created a perfect trap, using drugs to make Marcus more compliant while simultaneously positioning Emma as an unreliable teenager whose accusations couldn't be trusted. It was a masterwork of psychological manipulation that had nearly succeeded in destroying his family from within. "There's more, Dad," Emma said, her voice growing urgent. "James isn't just working for Victor Reeves. He's working for a whole network of people who target wealthy families like ours. They identify men who've lost their wives, men who are vulnerable because they're raising children alone, and they place operatives in positions of trust. Security directors, housekeepers, tutors, even friends and romantic interests. Then they systematically exploit those relationships to steal information, manipulate business decisions, and sometimes even arrange for accidents that eliminate inconvenient obstacles." The scope of the conspiracy Emma was describing was staggering. Marcus found himself thinking about other wealthy widowers he knew, other single fathers who had hired security personnel or brought new people into their inner circles after losing their spouses. How many of them might be facing similar betrayals? How many families had been destroyed by this network of predators who specialized in exploiting grief and vulnerability? "How do you know all this?" Marcus asked. "From Lucy Reeves. Before she died, she was investigating her father's business practices and discovered this network. She documented everything: names, methods, targets, case studies of families that had been destroyed. She hid all of her evidence in encrypted files that she shared with Sarah before she was killed." "You're certain she was murdered?" Emma nodded grimly. "Lucy was scheduled to meet with FBI investigators the day after she died. She was going to turn over all of her evidence and testify about her father's criminal activities, but someone made sure she never made it to that meeting." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Emma possessed the same kind of dangerous information that had gotten Lucy Reeves killed. His daughter wasn't just hiding from James Morrison and Victor Reeves. She was carrying evidence that could expose a criminal conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in the country. No wonder she'd been afraid to come home. "Emma, we have to get this information to the authorities. Detective Rodriguez seems trustworthy, and if we can present her with Lucy's evidence, along with what you've discovered about James, we can—"
"No!" Emma interrupted, shaking her head violently. "Dad, you don't understand. This network has people everywhere. Law enforcement, government agencies, the judicial system. Lucy tried to work through official channels, and look what happened to her. The only reason Sarah and I are still alive is because we've stayed hidden and haven't tried to use traditional law enforcement." Marcus felt a crushing sense of helplessness as he realized the true scope of their predicament. They possessed evidence of massive criminal activity, but they couldn't trust the very institutions that were supposed to protect them from such crimes. They were trapped between a network of powerful criminals and potentially corrupted law enforcement.
with nowhere to turn for help. "Then what do we do?" he asked, hating the defeat he could hear in his own voice. Emma looked out at the ocean for a long moment, her young face set with determination that reminded Marcus of Catherine at her most resolute. "We have to be smarter than they are," she said, echoing Sarah's words from the previous day. "We have to make them think they've won, while we gather enough evidence to expose them publicly in a way that they can't suppress or cover up." "How?" "By giving them what they want," Emma replied, turning back to face him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a 17-year-old. "We let James Morrison think he successfully manipulated you into making the business decisions Victor Reeves wants. We pretend that I've returned home chastened and traumatized, too scared to cause any more trouble. And while they think they're in control, we document everything, we gather evidence, and we build a case that's so airtight and so public that they can't make it disappear." "Emma, if we're wrong about this, if they discover what we're really doing, they'll kill us both. If we don't try, they'll kill us anyway. The only difference is whether we go down fighting or whether we let them destroy us slowly while we live in fear." Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with terror as he recognized that his little girl had grown into a young woman of extraordinary courage and intelligence. But he also understood that the plan she was proposing would require them to walk back into the very trap they were trying to escape, to trust their lives to their ability to deceive people who were masters of deception themselves. "All right," he said finally, taking her hands in his again. "We'll do it your way. But Emma, I need you to promise me something. If at any point this plan starts to go wrong, if you feel like you're in immediate danger, I want you to run. Don't worry about me. Don't try to be a hero. Just get to safety and expose everything you can to the public. Promise me." Emma smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and for a moment Marcus could see the little girl she'd been, the child who had trusted him to protect her from all the dangers of the world. "I promise, Dad, but you have to promise me the same thing. If something happens to me, don't let guilt or grief stop you from making sure these people face justice." Marcus pulled her into another embrace, holding her tightly as he made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Because the truth was that if anything happened to Emma, if these monsters succeeded in harming his daughter, justice would be the least of their concerns. He would use every resource at his disposal, every connection and advantage his wealth provided, to hunt down everyone involved in the network and make them pay for their crimes in ways that had nothing to do with courts or legal proceedings. But for now, they had a plan. Dangerous and desperate as it was better than remaining in hiding or trying to fight an enemy they didn't fully understand. They would return to the trap, pretend to be caught, and work from within to gather the evidence they needed to destroy their enemies. As they walked back toward Marcus's car, Emma suddenly stopped and grabbed his arm. "Dad, there's one more thing you need to know, about the text message that brought you here today." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "You didn't send it."
Which means they know about this meeting. James Morrison or Victor Reeves or someone else in their network lured you here, probably to see if you would follow instructions, to test how much you know and how you react under pressure. We're being watched, right now. Marcus resisted the urge to look around for hidden observers, knowing that any obvious signs of awareness would give away the game they were about to play. "Then we'd better make sure they see exactly what they expect to see," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to call James Morrison and tell him I found you here, that you're safe but traumatized, and that I'm bringing you home. Can you act the part of a scared, confused teenager who's learned her lesson about trying to investigate adult problems?" Emma's smile was grim but determined. "Dad, I've been acting that part for the past 3 weeks. The only difference is that now you'll be acting too." The drive back from Miller's Point was a masterclass in deception. Emma curled up in the passenger seat, her face turned toward the window in a posture that could be read as either sullen teenage attitude or traumatized withdrawal, while Marcus called James Morrison on speakerphone to report the miraculous discovery of his daughter. "James, thank God," Marcus said.
injecting just the right amount of relief and parental worry into his voice. "I found Emma. She's safe, but she's not in good shape. I think she's been living rough for the past few days, and she's clearly traumatized by whatever she's been through." James's voice crackled through the car's speakers, carrying perfectly calibrated notes of professional relief and protective concern. "That's wonderful news, Marcus. Where did you find her?" "Miller's Point," Marcus replied truthfully, knowing that James probably already knew their location from GPS tracking on the car. "She was just sitting by the old lighthouse, staring out at the ocean. When I called her name, she started crying and ran to me like a frightened child. I don't think she even knows what day it is." Emma made a soft whimpering sound that could have been genuine distress or carefully performed theater. Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her steady pulse and the slight squeeze she gave him in return. "Is she injured? Does she need medical attention?" "She's dehydrated and exhausted, but physically she seems okay. Emotionally, though, James, I think she's had some kind of breakdown. She keeps apologizing and saying she's sorry for causing trouble, but when I ask her where she's been or what happened, she just shakes her head and cries." It was the perfect story, painting Emma as a traumatized victim rather than an investigative threat, suggesting that whatever she might have discovered during her disappearance had been forgotten or suppressed by psychological trauma. James Morrison would hear this description and conclude that Emma posed no immediate danger to his operation. "I'm having the house physician come by to examine her, and I think we should consider having her speak with a psychiatrist as well. Teenage girls who go missing often experience significant psychological trauma, even when they're not physically harmed. We want to make sure she gets all the help she needs to recover from this experience." Marcus felt Emma's hand tighten in his at the mention of a house physician and psychiatrist, both of whom would presumably be under James Morrison's influence and could be used to further drug or manipulate her. But Marcus kept his voice steady and grateful. "That sounds like an excellent idea. Whatever Emma needs to get through this and feel safe again. I'll also want to debrief her about where she's been and who she might have encountered. If she was approached by strangers or if anyone tried to take advantage of her vulnerability, we need to know about it for security purposes." "Of course," Marcus agreed, though he could hear the real agenda behind James's words. The man wanted to know what Emma had learned, who she had talked to, what evidence she might have gathered. The supposed debriefing would actually be an interrogation designed to determine how much of a threat she still posed. When they arrived at the estate, James Morrison was waiting in the circular driveway with a small army of security personnel and what appeared to be medical staff. The scene was perfectly staged to suggest concerned professionals rushing to help a traumatized young woman, but Marcus now recognized it for what it really was: a carefully choreographed operation designed to isolate Emma and bring her under James's control. Emma played her part flawlessly, allowing herself to be helped from the car with apparent weakness, leaning on Marcus as though she could barely support her own weight. Her eyes were wide and slightly unfocused, her responses to questions monosyllabic and confused. To any observer, she appeared to be a fragile teenager overwhelmed by an experience she couldn't fully comprehend or remember. "Emma, sweetheart," James said, his voice carrying the warm concern of a family friend. "We've all been so worried about you. Can you tell us where you've been?" Emma looked at him with apparent confusion, then turned to bury her face against Marcus's shoulder. "I don't remember. I was scared. I just kept walking and walking, and then Dad found me."
It was a brilliant performance, Marcus realized. By claiming not to remember her experiences during the missing days, Emma was protecting Sarah and the women's shelter while simultaneously making herself appear harmless to James's operation. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Emma executed their dangerous charade with meticulous precision. Emma submitted to medical examinations and psychological evaluations, all while secretly recording conversations and gathering evidence. Marcus continued drinking his drugged coffee, but now Emma provided him with supplements that counteracted the benzodiazepines without James's knowledge. The breakthrough came when Emma discovered James accessing Victor Reeves' encrypted communication network from Marcus's home office.
Using skills learned from Lucy's hidden files, she documented the entire network, dozens of families being systematically destroyed across the country. When Detective Rodriguez returned with follow-up questions, Marcus was ready. He presented her with a USB drive containing irrefutable evidence, financial records, recorded conversations, chemical analysis of the coffee, and most damning of all, Lucy Reeves' complete files proving the conspiracy that had killed her. The arrests were swift and coordinated. James Morrison was taken into custody as he prepared Marcus's morning coffee, the drugged grounds still in his hands. Victor Reeves tried to flee the country, but was apprehended at his private airfield. Within days, the network began collapsing as dozens of operatives were identified and arrested. 6 months later, Marcus stood with Emma on the lighthouse cliff where their fight had truly begun. The trials had concluded with life sentences for the main conspirators. Emma, now 18 and headed to Stanford, had been instrumental in helping other families recover from similar betrayals. "You know what I learned from all this?" Emma said, watching the sunset paint the ocean gold. "What's that, sweetheart?" "That the best security isn't walls or cameras or bodyguards. It's trust between people who truly love each other." Marcus smiled, wrapping his arm around his daughter. For the first time in years, he felt truly safe, not because of any external protection, but because he and Emma had proven that together they were unbreakable.